Hey third grade, and welcome back to our science lab. I hope you have your lab coats on because we're diving right in today. And this week we're learning all about, drumroll please, rocks. This week we're learning all about rocks. If you look at this, it's a piece of pink Himalayan rock salt that's been turned into a lamp. But if you look at the perimeter of the rock, let me turn the light off for you. You can see that it has a lot of ridges and like little sharp edges. It's not a completely smooth round surface. Why is that? Why do you think rocks have so many ridges and indents? Why aren't rocks completely smooth? By the end of this lesson, you'll be able to tell me how rocks are broken down into smaller pieces. So we'll know exactly why they're not completely smooth. Let's head right on into it. So again, your goal is to be able to identify how rocks are broken down into smaller pieces. The Earth's surface changes in many different ways. One major process that causes the Earth's surface to change is called weathering. Take 20 seconds and think to yourself, what do you think weathering is? If you guessed that weathering is how rocks are broken down, you are correct. Weathering is the process in which rocks are broken down into smaller pieces. Many different things can cause weathering. Animals, plants, water, and temperature are all things that can cause weathering or cause rocks to break down into smaller pieces. Animals may burrow into the ground, causing weathering. Plants or trees can push into the surface of rocks, causing them to break into smaller pieces. Take 20 seconds to think to yourself, how do you think water causes weathering? As winter gets closer, the weather gets colder. Rain falls into cracks in the rocks and freezes. As the liquid water turns into ice, it expands. This widens the cracks. So when the ice melts, the rock is weaker and pieces crumble and fall away. This is a part of weathering. Okay, friends, so now that we know a little bit more about weathering and how rocks are broken into these smaller pieces by things like animals and plants, let's do an experiment so that we can observe how water breaks down pieces of rock. If you're going to conduct this experiment at home, please make sure you have parent permission as well as their supervision. If not, no worries, you can watch me do it and we'll observe my results. Let's get straight into it. The materials you'll need for this experiment are 2 cups of water, 2 mason jars, and various different candies. In this experiment, we will fill 2 mason jars with water. Both mason jars will have the same amount of candy in them. One mason jar will sit still for a minute, while the other one is shaken up for a minute. What do you think will happen with the candy that's in the shaken mason jar? Under your assignments for today, you'll see an observation sheet. This is the sheet you will fill out while watching this experiment. At this time, please pause the video. Go over to the observation sheet, fill out your name, as well as your hypothesis. What do you think is going to happen to the jar that is shaken? Don't tell me what you think is going to happen to the jar. Tell me what you think is going to happen to the candy inside the jar. Welcome back. Now that you've filled out your hypothesis, we can move on to our experiment. Step 1 is to gather your materials. I didn't have any mason jars, so I just gathered 2 glass jars with really tight lids. The items I'll be placing in the jar are goldfish, M&Ms, Now Laters, and these Lifesaver mints. Our next step is to place 1 cup of water into each mason jar. Next, you want to place the candy in the mason jars and set a timer for exactly 1 minute. I tried to place the candies in at the same exact time to get the most accurate results. Our next step is to close the jars. Try to close them as tight as you can so that when you shake the one jar, water doesn't go everywhere. Next, you want to shake one of the jars for exactly 1 minute. Let the other jar sit still. Try not to move it at all. Step 6 is to take the candy out so we can observe the results. These are the treats that were in the jar that did not get shaken. These are the treats from the jar that was shaken for a minute. Now we're going to look at each treat individually side by side so we can compare the treats from the jar that was shaken to the one that was not. I'm now going to make observations between the treats that were shaken and were not. I'm going to look at the left side, which is the treats that were shaken, compared to the right side, which are the treats that were not shaken. I might look at things such as the difference in texture that you can see in the pictures. If you look at the one at the left very closely, you can see little bumps that are not present on the one on the right. I'm also going to look at the size of the shape and think to myself, does the hole in the middle seem bigger on one side than the other? I wonder why the hole on the shaken side is much larger than the one on the not shaken side. Now let's observe the 2 now laters. Does the one on the left look a little bit smaller than the one on the right? When observing the M&Ms, notice that the ones on the not shaken side still have a little bit of their color as well as a white crust over them. The one on the shaken side does not have that at all. Now, for the goldfish crackers, notice that the one on the not shaken side, one of them have kept their shape, and you can still clearly see two separate crackers. But on the shaken side, it just looks like a pile of mush. Why is this? At this time, please pause the video and go back to your observation sheet so that you can fill out your observations for this portion of the experiment. If you need to, pause and rewind so that you can go over the results of the experiment again. Now, I know what you're thinking. What does this have to do with weathering? Well, remember, weathering is when rocks are broken down into smaller pieces by water, temperature, plants, or animals. So, using what we just learned about weathering, take 20 seconds and answer this. What do the candies in our experiment represent? If you guessed that the candy represents the rock that is being broken down into smaller pieces by the water, you're correct. Good job. The candy in this experiment is representing the rocks, and the water is the force that is breaking down the rocks into smaller pieces. Now, normally with weathering, it happens slowly over long periods of time. This experiment allowed us to have weathering happen very quickly so that we can notice the difference it would make in a rock. Now, take another 20 seconds and ask yourself, why do you think the jar that we shook broke down the pieces of candy more than the jar that was not shaken? The answer to this question is that the force of the water is much more vigorous or is much more intense on the jar that is being shaken in comparison to the jar that was not shaking. So, the candy broke down more in the jar that was shaken because the force was larger. At this time, please go back to your observation sheet and fill out your conclusion. Please make sure you use evidence from our experiment to support your conclusion. Your conclusion can be something like rocks are broken down into smaller pieces by water. I know this because in our experiment, the candy represented the rock and the candy was broken down by water. After you have completed filling in your conclusion, please submit your observation sheet. If you have any further questions, feel free to bring them to your teacher during her office hours. And I will see you guys next time we come into our science lab.